Benioff Children's Hospitals. And our initiative has been going strong since early 2018, and we have some really exciting things planned for you in 2020. It's been a lot of work for the committee, and I'd like for all of that group to stand now, and we can give them a round of applause. There you go. And particularly the education task force team that is responsible for the Grand Round series devoted to diversity, equity, and inclusion. And those co-chairs are Leanna Lewis and Anna Meyer. So we'll give them a hand. So without further ado, I will turn it over to Dr. Meyer.
Thank you very much. I'm so glad to see so many people in the room, and we are live streaming to Mission Bay, and so there's a whole other cohort there. And so I just have such a great pleasure to introduce Professor Claude Steele. He's going to talk for about 45 minutes, and then we will have some time for questions, and we'll try to navigate having questions even come from Mission Bay. So we'll ask you to hold your questions until the end, because it's a little bit hard with two sites to have questions come throughout the talk. So Claude Steele is an American social psychologist and a professor of psychology at Stanford University. He's best known for his work on stereotype threat and its application to minority student academic performance. His earlier work dealt with research on the self, both self-image and self-affirmation, as well as the role of self-regulation in addictive behaviors. In 2010, he released the book, Whistling Vivaldi and Other Clues to How Stereotypes Affect Us, summarizing years of research on stereotype threat and the underperformance of minority students in higher education. And I would say my initial reading in the first two times that I've heard him speak, because this will be my third, is I've incorporated many of those principles in how I coach my medical students. So I think it's something to think about how you might coach employees, anybody who is, we're all learners in different ways. So I want you to keep that in mind as you hear him speak. He holds a BA in psychology from Hiram College and an MA in social psychology from Ohio State University and a PhD in social psychology and statistical psychology from Ohio State University as well. He's elected to the American Academy of Arts and Sciences, the National Academy of Sciences, the National Science Board, the National Academy of Education, and the American Philosophical Society. He currently serves as the chair of the Russell Sage Foundation Board of Directors and also serves on the board of the John D. and Catherine T. MacArthur Foundation and on the board of Scripps College. Professor Steele is a fellow for both the American Institutes for Research and the American Academy of Political and Social Science and serves on the advisory council of the MIT Media Lab. He's served in several major academic leadership positions as the Executive Vice Chancellor and Provost at UC Berkeley, the I. James Quillen Dean for the School of Education at Stanford University, and is the 21st Provost of Columbia University. He also holds many honorary doctorates. So with all respect and admiration, we welcome you to come and speak with us today.
Pleasure to be here. I get my health care from UCSF. And I give the talks here. I really feel at home, so we can relax, talk through some things. I think the central question I want to focus on is how do you have a successful? I'm so sorry, they can't hear you. Okay. I think I did my part. But
we can't hear them in Mission Bay.
Could they hear you and you were on the...
When I talk into this, with this...
Would that be okay? That's going to restrict you.
Can 1, 2, this certainly seems to project louder than the other did. Yeah. Try it. 1, 2, 3. Is that better? Go ahead. 1, 2, 3. Getting better. Oh, okay, good. I'll be free. Okay. Picking up where I left off. The question that I want to address today is how do you have a successfully diverse community? And by community, I mean, within a classroom, within an institution like a university, within a hospital, within an organization, within a corporation, how do you actually have a diverse community work well in the sense that people feel free to and valued for contributing from the standpoint of their identities and backgrounds, and yet do not feel disadvantaged by those identities and backgrounds in the situation. How do we make this actually happen? This is a question that comes to me both from my research background and from my role as an administrator with some responsibility for it. Okay. Third try. You want this whole apparatus back?
Yeah.
It comes to me from, as I say, my research, but also just being in a position as a university administrator where you have a responsibility for such a community. How do you make it happen? How do you make it work? So that's the question. I think we psychologists, I'm a social psychologist, we're really good at explaining what keeps people apart, the nature of prejudice. This is the science that is most focused on that question, the nature of human prejudice. But we're not so good at explaining what it actually takes to bring people together, especially from diverse backgrounds that are freighted, charged backgrounds, and enable them to work effectively in organizations. Oh, listen.
We're going to have you stand here at the podium. This is the only way that they can really hear you.
Okay.
I'm so
All right.
sorry.
So should I turn this
Yes.
off? Okay.
This is legit. Yes.
Okay, if I stand up straight, or should I lean into the?
Get this as close as we can to you.
Okay, all right.
That is better.
Oh, that's nice. Okay. Though this will keep me in one place too for your camera. So I think this is a fundamentally American question. We have at least publicly decided to have an integrated society. Just to give some sort of 30,000-foot perspective on this issue, I think in the mid-'60s, the commitment of American society to being an integrated society is something that's a fruit of the civil rights movement of the 60s. It came into existence with the Voting Rights Acts and the Civil Rights Acts. And before that, we were able to and did legally segregate, legally discriminate on the basis of identity. And at that point in time, we made a major commitment to have an integrated society and to integrate our institutions. And I think one way of thinking about this is that we're still quite in the process of doing it. We're 50 years along the way, and it's maybe the first time in humankind that a society has made at least a public commitment to having such a society. For the most part, identities are the occasion dominant struggles and warfare. This is a society that at least publicly has made a commitment to having a diverse, integrated society where one's identity, as I say, can be a source of contribution and at the same time not a source of disadvantage. And that's a big deal. So I think it's a question we need to begin these discussions thinking about. One way of bringing that down to our daily lives is do our organizations, our institutions have the culture, the systems, the operating systems, in case of universities, do they have the pedagogies that are really able to deal with a genuinely diverse society? That's one way to think about the nature of the challenge. Have we evolved that way? I think the story begins with, well, there's one thing I want to say, maybe in the interest of warning. In my mind, this talk has two parts to it. This is a little bit different than a talk you've heard. The first part is a little dark and a little depressing and does go back to some of the roots of American society, but I think we need to cover that territory in order to make the second part of the talk, which I think is the more hopeful. I feel genuinely hopeful about this American project that I've just described. But I think in order to figure out how to deal with it, we need to confront the first part. So I'm going to spend a little bit of time with history and background, and then we'll get into some practical things that I think organizations, institutions can think about to make progress in this area. I think the story begins, at least again in my own thinking, with the recognition of the fact that we are rapidly becoming a even more diverse society than we have been. So having this commitment to having an integrated society and the society becoming more diverse all at the same time is part of the challenge. I'm sure you guys have heard the statistics. In 1970, I think 83% of the US population was white. It's about 62% now. In about another 20 years, it'll be less than half of the population. That's with regard to race and ethnicity. But you know, there are other articulations of identity that are increasingly important in our society. Just think of sexual orientation alone, but religion, immigrant status. These are all identities that are increasingly articulated in our lives and meaningful to people, and meaningful in the sense of how our society is organized and functions, how our institutions function. So I think that's the ground fact. And we have had a way of dealing with this diversity, an approach, a paradigm, a way of thinking about it. I might, for lack of a better term, call it identity blind, color blind, as it maybe is more commonly known, assimilationist approach. And I'm old enough to remember when this was a new and highly progressive and exciting idea, that we would not see people in terms of their identities. We would promise to see them in terms of as individuals. And we would ask them, for their part, to assimilate to the norms and standards of society as pretty much as fast as possible. And that would be the way, that's the offer on the table. That would be the way that we're going to incorporate this diversity into the mainstream of society. So in the context of that project, that's been perhaps the dominant strategy. And I think there are parts of it that we just cannot do without. We want many aspects of our lives to be governed by identity blindness. We want policing in our neighborhoods to be identity blind. We want fines and punishments, and we want access to opportunities to be identity blind. We want access to healthcare to be identity blind. So you could go on with that list to quite a degree. We need to have that as an assumption in our functioning. So I don't mean to dismiss this paradigm altogether, and I don't mean to solve the paradox in it. I want to, in a second, note the paradox, but I'm not going to solve it. I'm just going to state the fact that in addition to needing it, I think it has also blinded us to some realities, in particular, the significance of identity. We learned and practiced not thinking about identity, not understanding it, not seeing it as quite a legitimate topic of focus. And not understanding it, not thinking about it, I think our institutions haven't done as well as they could with regard to adapting to that reality. So a word or two about why identity is significant. And you know, as soon as, within 2 seconds, I think you'll see the point here. We have used identity to organize and stratify our society since the very beginning. Since the old world met the new world, we organized this society in terms of identity. And we use some of the most ruthless practices for doing that you could imagine, from genocide to slavery. And those were organizational strategies that were built around on the basis of identity, racial identity, ethnic identity, religious identities. They've been central to how this society has been organized, as they are to how many societies are organized. And if we think just in terms of a colorblind, identity blind approach, we would miss the significance of that. I was at a symposium about 1.5 years ago commemorating the 50th anniversary of MLK's assassination. And I listened to 4 panels of civil rights lawyers asking themselves the question, where should the civil rights energies focus now? What are the issues? And one panel after the next, one of the more depressing afternoons I've had in a long time. I mean, the riggings that still disidentify or disadvantage a person based on race are profound when you think about them and pull them up to look at. Just the impact of the legacy of housing segregation and all that goes with that. The value of your house is not as much. If the value of your house is not as much, that's the primary source of wealth in the United States. You won't be as wealthy. And not being as wealthy, you won't have this similar access to opportunities. Also, if that weren't bad enough, the quality of education that you're going to have an opportunity to be exposed to is going to be affected by that. The employment stress that families are going to be under in those kinds of communities, the concert of stresses that a person has to deal with, born into those circumstances, are profound. Just think of school to prison pipelines, access to medical care, access to good food. Again, the list goes on, so that almost in every aspect of life, there are these riggings still in place that affect you based on your identity. So I've cooked up a 25-cent term to try to capture these effects and to try to capture the fact that they go with having an identity. There are circumstances in life that go with having an identity. I call them identity contingencies. And all I mean by that is what I just said, that there are circumstances that go with having an identity. If you're a woman, you are going to have to deal with different circumstances in life than if you are a man. If you're an African American, if you come from a low-income community, and again, the list goes on. If you have a particular sexual orientation, if you have a particular religion, there are circumstances, conditions of life that because you have that identity, you have to deal with. They're not things that you can just choose not to deal with. Sometimes we psychologize identity to the point that we think it's just something inside one's head, you know, kind of a belief, a personality characteristic of some sort that I might be able to change if I just wasn't so hung up on it. But I want to point our attention to the realities that coming from how our society is organized around identity, the realities that people have to deal with because they have a given identity. And everybody has some set of contingencies tied to the identities that they have. I don't know why it's the case, but as I get a little older, I think about the contingencies tied to being older. And there are contingencies, things you have to deal with because you are older. The world responds to you differently. There are different expectations. So I'm just pointing to these. I'm designating these realities that come from identity that we might miss if we were colorblind. My own research on stereotype threat, I think, is an example of a social psychological contingency of identity that I think can have quite profound effects in the middle of one's life and of course across the course of one's life. Stereotype threat is simply being in a situation or doing something for which a negative stereotype about one of your identities, your age, your religion, let's say, is relevant. And when you're in that situation, you're doing something, you care about it, it's important to you, maybe important to your progress in life, and yet a stereotype about one of your identities is relevant to that. You're a woman in a STEM field. You're a white guy trying to play in the NBA. And a negative stereotype about your group is relevant to what you're doing. You know you could be seen and treated in terms of that stereotype. And if the activity is important to you and to your progress, then the prospect of being seen and treated that way is upsetting and distracting. And it can deter you from that whole walk of life because it just goes on. You could, for example, disprove the stereotype about women in math in your sophomore calculus course. But then when you get into your junior seminar on Riemann surfaces, you have to disprove it again. And you have to keep doing it because that stereotype is out there. It's everybody knows it, and you know that everybody knows it. And when you're in a circumstance where it's relevant, you have to kind of contend with it. It's a contingency of identity. So that work is trying to pull into view what the social psychological realities of identities really are, how they affect us. I can give you an example of sort of a cute example of an experiment that might demonstrate that. This was one done on athletic performance. Does the stereotype threat affect performance? Most of the work is done on its impact on intellectual performance, test performance, academic performance. This is done on athletic performance. So the researchers got really elite athletes at Princeton and Arizona State, white and black athletes, and they brought them into the laboratory one at a time, and they asked them to do a golf task in a miniature golf course, 10 holes, set up in a laboratory room. And they wanted to show the effects of a stereotype. So in the first condition of the experiment, they put the white athletes under the pressure of stereotype threat. And the way they did that is to simply say to them as they began, or just before they started this golf task, they said, look, this is a standardized test of natural athletic ability. We want you to do the best we can. Well, if you watch American sports at all, you know the stereotype is that it's the black guys that have the natural athletic ability, and it's the white guys that work real hard and are smart and all that. But if this is a test of natural athletic ability, and I'm an athlete, this is an area of life that's important to me to perform well in. When I'm in the middle of that golf task, and I experience the inevitable frustrations that go with doing that, I have to contend with the fact that I could be seen, or maybe I'm actually proving this stereotype about white guys not having, so I'm distracted by that. And sure enough, under that instruction, in that condition, the white guys underperform the black guys on the golfing task. But the tables can be turned by changing the stereotype that's relevant to the task. So in the other condition of the experiment, just before they take the golf task, the experimenter says, I want you to do the best you can. This is a standardized test of sports strategic intelligence. Okay, now the black guys are under the stereotype. Any little frustration they have could be confirming that nasty little stereotype coming out of American history about African Americans' intellectual abilities. And that, I want to just prove that. I don't want to accept that. But now I'm doing two things while I perform that golf task. I'm performing the golf task and I'm disproving the stereotype. And my attention, we psychologists know, is really going back and forth and interfering with performance. And sure enough, in that condition, the black athletes underperform in relation to the white athletes. Just to give you some sense of how this works, how this process works. In an experiment, you can sort of pull it out of everyday life and put it up on a platform so people can see it in a way. You can imagine taking the SAT or an IQ test or performing at the frontier of your skills in any kind of academic context or professional context for that matter, where you know that people know the stereotypes and how they, and that you could be judged in terms of them. Another way I've come to think about this is a simple sort of to characterize the nature of the psychological tension or stress in that situation is that it's kind of a contest between remembering and forgetting. Do I remember how my group is and has been treated in this society and use that memory to interpret what's happening to me in my current situation, my current circumstances? Do I remember that? Or do I just forget that? Try to just forget that. It's over. In the case of race, I'm in a post-racial world. I can forget all about how my group was treated and is treated. So there's an inherent, I think, kind of rational tension tied to our identities and the way our society has evolved to think about them, that is the stereotypes, there's an inherent tension, but kind of on a daily basis between, is that what, could that be coming from racism, or is that just nothing and I should ignore it? So now I'm distracted with this whole question, and I'm in the middle of a situation that's really important to my life, a professional situation. And here I am having to allocate precious cognitive resources to considering this distracting question. And that becomes, and then figuring out how to cope with it. And again, it's not a question that goes away. It's there on a regular basis. And it's, when the situation is important to one's livelihood, it's an important question. It's a tough question. All of this is to sort of give some sense of what the indispensable colorblind, identity-blind model. It's indispensable to our lives in many important ways. But what it misses, kind of misses the significance of our identities, both in terms of the real life contingencies that we have to deal with. Just think of the rocky road a Latinx student or a Latinx child has to go through in order to be fully identified with school. And to see that as the opportunity in life for upward mobility and progress. They're going to come from a family that's probably under considerable economic distress. There's going to be different, all kinds of stresses, consequences of that within the family, different vocabularies, different opportunities to represent school as the avenue to success and belongingness in American society. And just, again, I could enumerate them, and you could too, at some length. But when that child arrives at school, that child has gone over a much rockier road to get there and to care about it than other people in the same society, because of their identity and because of the things that are tied to that identity in our particular society. That's sort of the basic notion. And then from that time on, the individual is left with this basic question of the sort of remembering versus forgetting attention. What is happening to me? Am I still being responded to in terms of that identity, or am I free of that in this situation? And if I don't know the answer, that can be quite consequential. So I want to argue that this leaves many members of our society with a certain kind of what I'm going to call trust vigilance, that the fundamental issue, one of the fundamental issues that our identities, the sort of realities that they encounter in our organizations, in our institutions, is trust. It's hard for us, given our history as a society, to trust each other. Just hard, for the reasons I just elaborated on. So the hard commodity of having a successfully diverse community, a successfully integrated society, the real commodity is trust. I think many of us have experienced trust as individuals across group lines. But when you think at the institutional level, that may be where we're not doing such a good job of enabling everybody to trust the institution. And that may be the most important place to focus our efforts on with regard to building this kind of community. I just want to give a couple of examples to make that trust point clear. One has to do, it comes from an experiment we did on the simple question of how does a Black professor give critical feedback to an African-American student and have that feedback be trusted? How do you do that? You could analogize this to your own experience in an organization like this. How does a supervisor or a manager give critical feedback to an employee in a way that feedback would be trusted? Same question. So what we did in this experiment was have white and Black Stanford students. These are Stanford students. That's important because they're a highly selected set of students. Ability is beyond reproach. These are all smart kids. We bring them into the laboratory one at a time. We have them write an essay about their favorite teacher. And we tell them that we're interested because we're starting a new magazine on teaching on campus. And if we're looking at essays that might be published in that magazine. So give it your best shot. So they sit down, they write their essay, and we say, come back 2 days later, and you're going to get feedback on your essay. So when they come back 2 days later, we have actually graded the essays, stayed up late to do this, and we're going to measure how much they trust the feedback. How much do they trust it? And trusting it, how much are they motivated to respond to the feedback? That's the question here. Again, you can play this out in relation to manager, employee, as well as faculty and student. And what we vary is how you give the feedback. Is there a way to give this feedback that will enable it to be better trusted than another way? We found immediately 2 things that are most commonly done do not work. Just giving the feedback straightforwardly, or giving the feedback preceded by a kind of ad hominem bromide, something positive about the person. You know, I love your smile in class, and here's the feedback. You know, Black students did not trust that, and not trusting the feedback, they weren't motivated to respond to it. It's a contingency of identity. It goes with that identity. If we use that idea, you can sort of see why they wouldn't trust it. You just don't know where the feedback is coming from. In terms of this remembering, forgetting tension, I don't know whether the feedback is coming from the essay that I wrote and is good constructive feedback, or whether it's coming from how this feedback giver just sees my group, its preparation and its abilities. Maybe it's coming from there. I can't rule that out. That person's done. We don't have a relationship that is strong enough or trustworthy enough for me to rule that possibility out. So I have to consider the possibility that it's coming from the stereotype about my group. And then if that's the case, well then I can't, it's hard to take it seriously. And the particularly, I don't know, meaningful thing about this is that you could see that having that identity in that situation, that's going to go on in life. That's going to go on across all kinds of circumstances. That's not something that you just have in one phase of life and it's over. It's always there. So that's how fundamental this trust question can be. Can I benefit from the feedback that I'm being given? Maybe the feedback is perfectly constructive. We thought it was, but here's a group based because of their identities and the ambiguities that identity imposes on that feedback. It's difficult to trust it. And then not trusting, it's difficult to benefit from it. And then not benefiting from it, that's a circumstance that goes on in a chronic way because it's tied to the identity and to the nature of our society and our history. If we had a different history and we were in a different society, maybe it would be completely different. This is American society. And these stereotypes are American. If we went to Lagos, Nigeria, this would just be off the table. None of this would be relevant. They would have their own forms of stereotype threat and identity pressures. Maybe they would be tied around rural-urban status or between religions, tribal identities, but they wouldn't be tied around race. That's our situation. And it reflects our history, and it's the reality, it is the nature, it is the event of our history coming down into our daily lives. Our history is quite with us. It is not past, it is quite with us. Another example, just to sort of drive that home, and this may have some greater relevance to your own experience, but I think of having been a parent and now being a grandparent and seeing this recapitulated. Just think about the typical parent-teacher conference in which the parents are an African-American couple and the teacher is white. And the student they're talking about are the parent's son. And just think about what that situation is and think about the way our history as a society sets that whole thing up. The African-American couple is coming in hell-bent on getting that teacher and that school more generally not to see their child's ability through the lens of racial stereotypes about African Americans. They know the stereotype and they know the hair trigger tendency for people, even without awareness, to see their child in terms of it. And they know that. That's a reality for them. So they're coming in unable to completely trust this situation because they know the history of the United States, they know the stereotypes that have come from that history, and they know that it could be relevant to their son. That's their form of stereotype threat there that breaks the trust. The white teacher, for her part, has got an equally sort of malignant role assigned to her by history, which is that, geez, if I say one thing critical to this family, I'm going to be seen as a racist. That's the stereotype whites have in that situation. How can I be helpful to this child if anything I say that is critical is going to be seen as evidence of my racism and my disinterest in this child's welfare and progress? So there we have a typical everyday kind of experience in American society. It's recapitulated in your lives, my life, on a regular, ongoing basis, in which the real actor in the situation is history and the stereotypes that come from that history. It's a situation lathered in history. If we were in almost any other society, you wouldn't see such, there wouldn't be such attention. But given our history and the stereotypes about it and the contingencies that imposes on us, that's a good illustration of what we're working through when we talk about diversity. Is that needs to be seen. The significance of identity needs to be seen and understood, as opposed to just repressed and denied, in the sense that our colorblind approach, our identity blind approach, which seems so gratifying at one level and is so necessary at another level, but it isn't sufficient. Our institutions get stagnated around diversity, and we continually, I'm of a certain age, and I have just seen this discussion for 50 years. Let's do the math there, but for a long time. As a provost, I'm having the same conversations about diversity I had when I was a brand new professor, 45 years ago. And I think it's in part because we're not in appreciation of this basic reality. Okay, that's the dark part of the talk. What can we do about this? Well, I do think that there has to be this understanding about trust. I think there is a lot of research that I know about, I can point you to, that shows interest in this sort of a new wave of research that shows some interesting strategies that deal with trust. In that experiment about giving the feedback, there is one such strategy emerges, giving the feedback about the essays. There was a way of giving that feedback that was trusted by the African American students. And that way of giving the feedback is when they came in that second day to get the feedback on the essay that they'd written. When the experimenter said, look, we're using really high standards in evaluating this essay because we're considering them for publication in this teaching magazine we've got. And I've looked at your essay, and I think you can meet those standards. I think you can meet those standards. That was shockingly effective with African American students. You're in several ways telling them they're not being seen stereotypically. You're using high standards and you think they can meet them. And this feedback, critical as it is a testament to your faith in them. I think that's at the core of what our institutions have to understand. And that is a big shift in paradigm from the way our institutions function for the most part. In my institutions, I'll take the heat. In universities, oftentimes it's like, look, I teach chemistry, I give a good lecture, that's my end of my responsibility. No, in a diverse society, the professor, sacred as that is, has to come to the students and signal to them that he or she has faith in their potential. You have to grant that to them, because the stereotype structure, the general cultural understanding, the general culture that we live in does not grant that to them. It doesn't grant that to them. And if you just think that your job is to sort of let the talent rise, let those who have the talent, that will show itself over time. I can't, account for somebody's talent in chemistry. That's not my responsibility. I'm just supposed to give a lecture and I'll see you. I've got work to do. That's where our organizations operate, and I think that is at the dead center of where we're stagnated as a society. There's evidence of when you come to the students and you grant that potential, then you start to get really dramatic differences in performance, differences that shock everybody, surprise everybody. How can that be? We're so used to these achievement gaps and these performance gaps and these income gaps that we just take them as natural law, that there's something, and the easiest way to account for that is to just use the stereotype to explain it, or some version of the stereotype to explain it. When in fact, it may be sustained by these kind of processes I'm describing. These gaps may be in big part sustained by the stereotype pressures that people are under as a function of the history of our society. And if you unravel that, you might see some very dramatic differences in how people perform. I'll give you an example of one. This is we did a survey at UC Berkeley of the graduate programs in science, in the math department, the physics department, the chemistry, astronomy, earth and planetary sciences, electrical engineering, computer sciences, on and on, all of the physical science departments. And our question in this survey was, do the women and minorities in these graduate programs perform at the same level as the men with regard to the real critical coin of the realm of graduate school, which is publication and scientific progress? Things, in graduate school, grades, whatever. But if you can publish and you can move science forward, that's what counts. That's what moves people. That's what makes you into a scientist. You're a consumer. You're not just a consumer of knowledge, you're a producer of knowledge. And it's that transition that's critical. And as you might expect, the survey found what it feared, which was that in every one of these departments, no, the women and the minorities were doing substantially worse than the men, except with regard to the College of Chemistry. For some reason, here's a bright spot. Reliably, the women and minorities in chemistry, their graduate program, were doing as well as the men. There was no difference. Moreover, the College of Chemistry have produced most of the women chemists who occupy the prestigious professorships in chemistry across the country. A way disproportionate number come out of that single program. So what is it that that program is doing that could create that, that would overcome that, all those expectations? Nobody was one iota surprised about this gap that was revealed in that a survey. Everybody just took it as a matter of course. Yeah, there's just going to be this performance difference here. Sorry. So what did they do? Well, for some reason, probably completely unrelated to diversity and an ambition to have a more diverse science, they just decided at some point that in addition to doing their own wonderful Nobel Prize winning research, they wanted to produce the best chemists in the country. They wanted to produce them. And so they just sort of got down to, well, what are the nuts and bolts? What keeps somebody from not succeeding in our program? And so they came up with several things. Well, people come and, oftentimes it's a surprise, but, people don't really know what graduate school's about. You get in, but you think it's the same thing as undergraduate school, that, you just need to get good grades and you keep going. And you don't understand that it's really about, not about grades at all, but it's about coming up with research and having relationships with research advisors and colleagues that moves a research program, that innovates a research program and moves it forward. And so, well, we're going to tell them that right at the beginning. We're going to have a 3-week seminar, induction before the school year, in which we give them this cultural capital. This is what graduate school is about. It's so that puts everybody in the same level. If you didn't do that, it could be that the students who had a really good undergraduate background, or who maybe came from a family that knew about graduate school and knew about how science runs, and those students would come into the chemistry college and they would do really well right away, and the faculty would probably spend most of their time with those students and say to themselves with regard to the other students, well, they've got a chance, we'll just see how they do, and talent rises, the cream will rise. That would be the dominant way we educate at that level. I would say that's true in my own department, psychology at Stanford. I would say that's the dominant way. We kind of, and what that means is that the boys are going to talk to the boys in big part. That's where they feel the compatibility, and in feeling the compatibility, they interpret that as talent, and they get along, and the relationship is not complicated. There aren't the same jeopardies involved there. So there's so many down on the ground factors that set up a bias in how those really critical relationships that make you into a scientist get established. And what the chemistry college is doing is breaking that down and making it much more democratic by sort of systematically giving everybody the cultural capital. You come 3 weeks, you get this information about what it's about, you are given appointments with 5 faculty, and they tell you, you could do this project, you could do that project. So you get to see what you're supposed to be doing. You know where you are. It takes the ambiguity out of the situation. You pick a project, you have to have a written proposal by November 11th. By March 3rd, you have to have that research done. And by June 2nd, you have to have submitted it to a conference or a journal. And you get all the support you need for that. You meet with the faculty every single week, and there is a faculty committee overlooking the faculty to make sure that those meetings happen, and that they report to this oversight committee how those meetings are going. So you come into a world in the chemistry college where you kind of know what it's about right away. You don't have any long periods of ambiguity and sorting through what it all means. All that ambiguity invites in the stereotypes and forces you to consider them. It makes the whole situation weighty and difficult to know where you stand and what is real progress here and who's really making progress. It kind of clears all that brush away so that those stereotypes and the like just don't have the same kind of impact on you, and you get great progress. Without all that, we interpret these differences in performance as differences in ability, differences in preparation in a more kind way. But they're really differences, I want to argue, in a big part due to these kinds of dynamics that are just inherent in our institutions. And that to make real progress, we need to address these kind of things, or we're going to continue to have the kind of frustration and stagnation that exists. We need to appreciate the experience of having identity and what it means in our institutions. One simple way of summarizing kind of theoretically what the College of Chemistry does, it can be boiled down to a basic psychological theory about stress and the nature of stress. There are lots of authors of this perspective. It's a finding that just pops up ever since the beginning of psychology, that stress is tied to 2 appraisals. The first appraisal, called the primary appraisal, is this situation threatening and stressful? Is it stress? And if the appraisal says yes, then the person goes into quite a stress reaction at every level, physiological, psychological, and the like. But there's also a secondary appraisal. And the secondary appraisal is there something I can do about it? And if there's something I can do about it, and I know I can do something about it, I've got support in doing that, stress goes down. Simple example, how does a person live in a complicated, dense city like New York, or increasingly San Francisco? How do you live? That's stressful. The traffic, the homeless problems, the drug, everything. It's stressful. Well, those of us who live in those circumstances, we figure out ways of coping with it. We figure out ways, strategies for dealing with it, and we get on with life. It reduces the level of stress. Somebody who comes in new to that without a pathway, a strategy for dealing with it, is going to have a lot of stress in a situation. And I think that's a general principle for thinking about our organizations. Yes, the identity nature of our institutions is stressful. And what people often need is a clear, supported pathway for dealing with it. It has to be clear, but the more concrete, the better, and it has to be supported. And they have to have confidence that they're going to be supported along this pathway, and they're not going to be tested along the pathway, that they're given the presumption of having the ability to move along this pathway. That has to be given and acted upon as a way for our institutions to function. And that's the basic point I feel like I'm arriving at in thinking about these things, is that we need to give our people pathways, and we need to support them on those pathways, and we need to help them have confidence in that. I think of my own experience in graduate school as a good example of that, being under all the stresses that I've just talked about for at least the first year and a half in graduate school, and really just under a lot of stress, weight loss, and the like. And then having my advisor, I think he was as I've said many times, I think he was coming up for tenure, and I was the only graduate student he had. So I was the only horse he had to ride to get this work done. So he had to take me seriously, but he did take me seriously, and I could see that he took me seriously, that he treated me like he paid attention to me. He listened to what I said. We worked together. He had really demanding standards. But I could see and not object to them at all, because I could see he took me seriously. He granted to me the abilities that I wasn't even sure about myself. He granted them to me, and he treated me accordingly. And that kind of pulled out of me a level of behavior and performance that otherwise, I hadn't been able to do. So I can go back over my life and look at instances of this. You can certainly, I think, athletic performance, good coaches do this, get the most. You have to believe in people. And you have to let them know you believe in them, signal that. And then you can start to see progress that I think is otherwise really going to be hard to see. And I'll end here with one feature of this that I like, and this is a perception that comes to me, especially experience as a provost, looking out on a university community. What you often see in the area of diversity is a kind of mindset of defensiveness, and it's often it's just become so much the water we swim in that we don't even think twice about it. We just have an inherent kind of yawning defensiveness. It's one of the most tiring, irritating topics you can possibly bring to somebody. You want to talk about diversity? Oh God! People just feel in jeopardy, like they're going to be stereotyped. It's just loaded and freighted with American history. One thing I remember being in Columbia, and we would press the deans and the chairs to increase faculty diversity. And they would come back with, they might try a little bit for a little while, and then they wouldn't make much progress on it. And they'd come back and they'd say, well, there's nobody in the pipeline, and I'm sorry, and quit hammering on me, and quit holding resources over my head, because I can't do any better than what I'm doing. And that situation, that communication, that sent them off in a completely defensive way of thinking about it, and they would incorporate their colleagues, and the defensiveness turned into truisms. You know, the pipeline is not full. There's nothing I can do about this. And an attempt to move away from the situation, to not talk about it. And the whole institution, when you look at the whole institution, when you're just in one department, you think it's just your department. No, this is happening everywhere. So the whole culture of the place is in the grip of this framework. So why not, you know, we try the strategy, why not, okay, you know, the pipeline's empty. Well, can you tell me what you could do over the next 3 years that would help fill the pipeline? Could you get more women into your introductory chemistry courses and could you do that? Or maybe you could get more minorities as majors, or maybe you could have a post-bac program that would bring in people who didn't major in your field but would like to, or maybe you could do grad. You know, you tell me over the whole span of what the institution does, what's possible to make some progress, and you give me your goals for 3 years, and let's all forget about making Columbia have the most diverse faculty. I don't mean forget about it; it's too strong a statement, but let's not focus exclusively on that to the exclusion of everything else. So you could begin to. And honestly, it was like some of the ice thawed when people, because people would like to. I want to be optimistic here. I think people would like to contribute, but it's too freighted with these identity threats I'm talking about, and it's not clear what they can do about it. And so if you can't address and rectify an inequality or an injustice, if you can't actually fix it, you justify it. You explain it in a way that makes you comfortable with it. That's what gives birth to stereotypes, our rationalizations to explain inequalities. And if we were to focus all of our attention on eliminating stereotypes or eliminating prejudice, and we did it, let's say we waved a magic wand and we wiped prejudice off the face of the earth in the morning, and we didn't change any of those inequalities, new prejudices or the same prejudices would be back by the afternoon. They're the after effects of inequalities. And they're not going to go anywhere until those inequalities begin to go somewhere. And the hope of this strategy is that everybody can participate in building trust. Everybody can get in that game. Trust is a game that is played on the ground. It's who shows up, it's who listens, it's who really helps you, figures out what you need and helps you. And that's it. My advisor, did he have any sophistication about the African-American experience? No. Was he African-American? Whoa, no, he was not African-American. He came from the South. We used to argue all the time about bluegrass music versus the blues. He was, I thought, culturally pathetic, but so it wasn't there was some compatibility there that had to be there for that. The man helped me, and he gave me a concrete way forward that I could believe in, and he supported me on that path, and that was enough. Did he ever have a prejudiced thought, a racist thought? Of course he did. Everybody does. Everybody does. We psychologists, that may be a secret among our tribe, but we all know that everybody, you cannot exist in this society without having that kind of a thought. So to put the whole emphasis is on that is probably a misguided thing. So anyway, I'm getting the time signal, so I better bring this to an end. Thank you.
Lovely to have such a large audience and to have your thoughts. And definitely, it was different again. So I enjoy hearing it a third time. Professor Steele will be here for a few moments if you have questions in the room. And then I think we're going to, questions can come to the computer and Sadie can share them with me. But if those who need to go, they can go. So I'll be happy to help field questions. Yes, Leanna.
Thank you so much, Dr. Steele. Steele, we have so much trust vigilance with our patients and families, and
Yeah.
then amongst us on the care team. And so I'm curious if you have thoughts about how we even begin to incrementally go about managing that trust vigilance when it's happening kind of bi-directionally. You know, it's back and forth and side to side in these dynamic relationships with patients and families, and then with us as care team.
Well, you know, I'm going to. You're asking me to speculate, so I'll because I'm not in that situation, and so I wouldn't be able. I haven't thought it through in that sense. I can only bring general principles to bear, but the general principle, and maybe I can think of myself as a patient, to the extent that I think, you know, my physician is interested in me, and has a little time for me to actually hear what I'm thinking and feel, I trust them more. So a lot of it could be that in that domain where I can because I've had at this age many different physicians, and many of them just breeze you, and you don't like it, you don't trust them, you don't really listen to them that much. But a couple of them you get to be kind of, I want to say friends, but you get a closer relationship. And I trust what they tell me, because they seem to have thought about what I told them. And they seem to have come to some real, you know, helpful advice about it. So I think we do have, in that kind of situation, the opportunity to build trust, to signal.
Which is one of the things that we've seen in literature is that when there's race concordance between the provider and the patient, more trust is built. And sometimes, from what I'm taking from your talk, is that others can abdicate. They say we need to have more providers of color to take care of the patients of color. And in fact, we need other groups to learn how to develop that trust and say I'm trustworthy, instead of saying, okay, all of you can go over there and we'll stay here and be comfortable where we are, right?
I couldn't say it better myself.
Thank you. Yes.
My problem is, you know, I'm an African-American physician here. When I came 30 years ago to this institution, there was 3 hospital-based Black males. Now there's 2 hospital-based Blacks for 30 years. How do you trust the system? When I talk to the administration, everybody says the right words. Everybody says that they're for diversity. But if it was about losing money or not seeing enough patients, they would not tolerate this situation for 30 years. But they tolerate this situation and allow failure. So how do you deal with the trust of your institution that says all the right things, that puts all the committees in place, but does nothing?
We're sort of the same age. Have seen some of the same. I would say everything I've just said is driven by that experience. It's trying to think through, where does that experience come from, and it comes down to this trust question. That's why I talk a lot about identity blindness, color blindness. I think that's at fault here. That people, you know, there's a new a framework that several people seem to have come up with. One is Ibram Kendi's book, How Not to Be a Racist. He's got an interesting book out there. And in the first chapter, he makes the argument that in America, you are either a racist or an anti-racist, that there isn't a neutral ground. And I like that, because I think there's a truth to that you can't just say, I'm colorblind myself personally. I struggle to do that. I don't have to deal with those patients because maybe they need some people from their own background. You know, everything to sort of take me out of the zone of responsibility. That's racist. That's racist. I'm having this argument in my department that we use a really stringent admission criteria for students who are applying computational work. You had to have this many courses and that many courses. And I understand that, but your job is to teach them. And you should give them those courses and not just say, well, they don't have them, so that's racist. That's racist. So I like this definition because it shifts. We're Americans, and if you think that racial inequality is something that you can, as long as you have convinced yourself that you're not prejudiced or something, that you can abdicate responsibility for, that's racist. So we need a new conception here that puts people more on the spot. That's just racist. You are condoning and doing nothing to dismantle an entire structure of racial privilege and racial disadvantage. I mean, we've used race to define racial advantage from the very beginning, and and continues to be so in the structures and the tissue of our society that you can't just say you got to undo it. You have to contribute to undoing it. So I think we need a new framework with regard to this problem, or we will be, or our children will feel like me and you feel. This is just goes on this way. It's the stagnation that is the symptom of the fact that we haven't gotten to the bottom of it yet, and that we've enabled to evolve a framework for thinking about this that doesn't put people on the spot and show them their personal responsibility for undoing the racism that is so fundamentally at the core of this society. And I could point to other identities too. There's just been a hegemony, a supremacy that has been at play and is at play. And if we don't struggle to undo that, then we're racist and worse.
I think one of the actions
Here, here.
is to think about someone you might actually, like in the next week, make an assignment for yourself. Someone you would like to ask to do something more than they do, or something that you'd like to do, an action, a step in the right way of actually taking action instead of waiting for action to happen around you. As a white woman, that's something that I think about daily is how often I lean into non-action and how on a daily basis I think about the action that I need to take and not be comfortable. So, and think about, is there someone you can ask who has a privileged identity maybe that you trust enough to be able to ask them to take an action?
Yeah, one thing I would add is that I don't think we're asking a lot of those people.
I always say that people think that this is hard work, but it's actually win-win work. It feels tremendously powerful to start to not be inactive.
Yeah.
So it's not painful if you start. There's a question back there. Yes.
Hi, I'm a clinical fellow, so I've done a whole lot of different pieces of education, as well as now as a physician, I really do consider being an educator as part of my job, because it's part of the other in the end. But I wanted to ask you if you have any thoughts or advice for if you are a student who is trying to take action or spurn others who are your teachers or you're supposed to be your mentors or your whoever is above you, and you're asking for their support and they're not giving it to you. I think that as an educator, I can say I want to give other people who are behind me support, but I think something that's really, really difficult is when, hey, I know I can do this, I'm trying to say publish, and I need you to give me the feedback on the paper that I'm giving you so that I can do the next step. And any thoughts about how we can spurn the greater people or institution to actually providing that support?
Yeah, I mean that's the core question, and I've been thinking about it primarily from my more recent vantage point as an administrator, and I've developed, as you might detect, a little frustration with my faculty colleagues on this matter because they have such a stock set of defenses about this, and we're just asking them to be human beings here and to respond to people as human beings, but we have to but they often feel like doing what you say is a highly jeopardizing interaction. That the stereotype threat they feel is that, like the teacher, they could screw up and get called a racist. Or if the student doesn't do well, they could get called a racist or seen as a racist. And who in the world would want that? And so there's just this resistance. I think it's more about that than it is about actual prejudice and actual belief in the negative stereotypes. I think we're sort of at loggerheads about this. So I don't know what to recommend other than to have this kind of a conversation with the people involved. That, look, I'm not set to see you this way. I need help. I want to trust here. I don't want to see you as a racist or anything. But I just need real help. And here's what I need you to look at my paper and give me some feedback on that. And I need you to have some faith in my potential. I don't want you to, because the dominant paradigm is it's at the beginning of the year, the old saw that look to your left, look to your right. You have to prove yourself. That's the way we've handled it no, that it has to be. I believe in all of you. I believe you're here. You can do this, and I'm going to show you the path to a concrete path for doing it. You can tell your supervisor that I need a concrete path and I need support on that path. I need reliable, consistent support along that path. That's what I need from you. I don't need you to be black like me. I don't need you to be an expert in African American history. I don't need a whole lot of things that you might worry about or use as an excuse here. I just need you to be here in the role that you are committed to exercising in this institution. I need your help. And what that means is I need a concrete path forward. I don't even need to belong at your cocktail party or in your friendship network. Belonging, I need a path forward here. And I need your help in getting along this path. And then we'll see what happens with the rest of it. I think that's a good way to orient somebody in this situation.
I have one more question, and it's from, I want to sort of encourage the voices that are not in this room who have tried to ask about the computer. So last question is from Miguel Linares. In an attempt to establish trust, say, between a student and a professor, is there value in acknowledging the social contingencies you talked about? Which party should be responsible for bringing that up?
Yeah, I know it's very fashionable to not to think to worry about who's got the responsibility in that interaction, and to worry, and maybe as a minority, that I'm going to have too much of a responsibility. I'm going to have an extra burden here because I'm the one that has to educate these people, and so on and so forth. Well, I don't know. I don't care that much about that. I think it's a learning opportunity that you get trust by giving it. I feel this is the ethos in which the civil rights movement began. We have to put yourself forward in a way that offers trust. There's a great interview of Obama by Ta-Nehisi Coates, and they have a discussion about trust. And Coates says, geez, man, you trust white people. You were raised by them, and you were raised in Hawaii. And so you are giving them trust, which is a very interesting phrase. You are giving them trust, which is the power of Obama. He gave them trust. He said, I trust this union that we can have as a society. And Coates says, it's hard for me to do it because both my parents were Black Panthers. I grew up in the inner city Baltimore, and it's really hard for me to trust. So I think we are talking about an economy of trust. And I do think it gets down to the base. I wish I could have a fancier way of putting it, but we have to give it to get it. And we have to, there's vulnerability in that. There's maybe an unfair burden in that. But I don't know another way. Thank you.